Imagine being the first, the only, carrying the weight of an entire race on your shoulders every time you stepped in front of a camera. You can't be angry, can't be flawed, can't be human. You have to be perfect, dignified, intelligent, morally superior. Because if you fail, if you show weakness, America will use it as proof that your entire race deserves discrimination. That was Sidney Poitier's burden for 30 years. And it made him a legend, but it also made him a symbol instead of a man. And by the end, even he wasn't sure which one he really was. February 20th, 1927 in Miami, Florida, but only by accident. Sidney's parents, Reginald and Evelyn Poitier, were Bahamian tomato farmers who'd traveled to Miami to sell produce. Evelyn went into labor prematurely. Sidney was born in Florida, making him automatically a U.S. citizen, a quirk of geography that would change everything. The family returned to Cat Island in the Bahamas, where Sidney grew up in crushing poverty. No electricity, no running water, an outhouse, survival farming. This was poverty most Americans couldn't imagine. At 15, Sidney was sent to Miami to live with his brother, America in 1943. Jim Crow South. Sidney, who'd grown up in the Bahamas where black people were the majority, suddenly experienced American racism for the first time. Separate water fountains, back of the bus. Whites-only signs, the Klan. Violence. Sidney was confused, then angry, then terrified. At 16, he fled north to New York City. Worked as a dishwasher, could barely read. Had a thick Bahamian accent nobody understood. He was nobody. From nowhere, with nothing. But Sidney wanted to act, or tried out for the American Negro Theatre in Harlem. Was rejected, couldn't read well enough, accent was too thick, had no training. So Sidney bought a newspaper, taught himself to read by sounding out words. Worked on his accent by listening to radio announcers for hours. Tried out again. Was accepted. By the late 1940s, Sidney was getting small roles on Broadway. In 1950, he made his film debut in No Way Out, playing a doctor. Hollywood noticed here was a black actor who could play intelligent, dignified roles. And this is where Sidney Poitier, the symbol, was born. But here's the truly shocking part. In 1950s Hollywood, black actors played maids, porters, comic relief, criminals, shuffling, subservient stereotypes. Sidney refused. He would only play characters with dignity, intelligence, moral authority. This was revolutionary and limiting, because Hollywood would hire Sidney only when they wanted a good black man to prove they weren't racist. He became the acceptable black actor, the non-threatening one, the one white audiences could watch without feeling uncomfortable. Through the 1950s, Sidney built his career carefully. Blackboard Jungle in 1955, playing a troubled student. The Defiant Ones in 1958, chained to Tony Curtis, earning his first Oscar nomination. A Raisin in the Sun in 1961, the film adaptation of Lorraine Hansberry's play about a black family in Chicago. Sidney was becoming a star, but always playing the same type. Dignified, educated, morally superior. The perfect Negro. The one who proved black people deserved equality by being better than white people. In 1964, Sidney won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Lilies of the Field, playing a handyman who helps German nuns build a chapel. He was the first black man to win Best Actor. Not the first black Oscar winner. Hattie McDaniel won Best Supporting Actress in 1940 for playing a slave. But the first leading actor. Sidney stood on that stage accepting his Oscar, knowing what it meant. He wasn't just Sidney Poitier winning an award. He was representing every black actor who'd been shut out. The burden of that moment was crushing. Then came 1967, 3 films that defined Sidney's career and his dilemma. to Sir with Love, playing a teacher in a tough London school. In the Heat of the Night, playing a Philadelphia detective confronting racism in Mississippi. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, playing a doctor whose engagement to a white woman forces her liberal parents to confront their own prejudices. All three were massive hits. Sidney was the biggest box office star in America, black or white, but he was trapped. Wait, don't miss this detail. In the Heat of the Night, there's a famous scene. A white racist slaps Sidney's character, Detective Virgil Tibbs. Sidney slaps him back, immediately, hard. In 1967, a black man slapping a white man on screen was shocking, revolutionary. Black audiences cheered, but Sidney later admitted, that moment was written into the script, carefully, justified by the plot, morally defensible. He couldn't just be angry, he had to be righteously angry. Even his defiance had to be perfect. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was worse, as Sidney plays a Nobel Prize-nominated doctor, literally the most accomplished black man Hollywood could imagine, and he still has to justify his worthiness to marry a white woman. The entire film is about proving he's good enough, and he's so perfect, so accomplished, so morally flawless that no reasonable person could object. That was Sidney's entire career, proving black people deserved equality by being superhuman. By the late 1960s, younger black actors and activists were criticizing Sidney, called him an Uncle Tom, said his characters weren't real black men, they were fantasies designed to make white people comfortable. Where was the anger, the pain, the real experience of racism? Sidney defended himself. Someone had to be first. Someone had to break down the doors. He'd carried that burden so others could walk through. But the criticism hurt because it was partly true. In the 1970s, Sidney's film career declined. America was changing. Blaxploitation films were rising. Shaft, Superfly, black heroes who were tough, sexual, flawed, real. Sidney's dignified, perfect characters felt dated. He turned to directing, had success with Uptown Saturday Night and Let's Do It Again in the mid-1970s. But his acting roles dried up. Hollywood had used him to prove they weren't racist, then moved on. You won't believe this, but Sidney Poitier, the most famous black actor in the world, struggled to get work in the 1980s to 90s. Did a few films, mostly supporting roles. Hollywood had decided his era was over. The dignified, perfect black man wasn't needed anymore. They had other black actors now. Eddie Murphy, Denzel Washington, Samuel L. Jackson, who could play complex, flawed, real characters. Sidney had fought so hard to prove black actors could play dignity that he'd become synonymous with only dignity. The symbol had consumed the man. Personally, Sidney was complicated. Married Juanita Hardy in 1950, had 4 daughters. Divorced in 1965, had a 9-year affair with actress Diahann Carroll while both were married. Passionate, tumultuous, ultimately destructive. Married Joanna Shimkus in 1976, had 2 more daughters. Sidney was private about his personal life, carefully managing his image. Even his relationships had to maintain the dignified Sidney Poitier brand. The man behind the symbol remained largely hidden. In 2002, Sidney received an Honorary Oscar for his lifetime achievements. Denzel Washington won Best Actor the same night for Training Day, playing a corrupt cop, morally complex, nothing like Sidney's characters. Denzel thanked Sidney in his speech. "I'll always be chasing you, Sidney." And you could see it in Sidney's face, pride, but also something else. Relief, sadness. The burden was finally being shared. Sidney continued working occasionally, a role in The Last Brickmaker in America, voice work, a few TV appearances. Wrote his autobiography. Received a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II. He was now Sir Sidney Poitier. Honours poured in. Presidential Medal of Freedom, Lifetime Achievement Awards. But the question lingered. Who was Sidney Poitier beyond the symbol? On January 6, 2022, at his home in Los Angeles, Sidney Poitier died at age 94. Tributes poured in. Presidents, actors, activists praising him as a pioneer who broke barriers. And he did. Absolutely. But the cost of being first, of being the only, of being perfect for 30 years, that cost was his humanity. Sidney Poitier, the symbol, was celebrated, but Sidney Poitier, the man, remained largely unknown. And this is where the story gets complicated. Sidney was a pioneer who suffered so others wouldn't have to, but his perfection also set an impossible standard. For decades, black actors had to prove they could be as dignified as Sidney Poitier to get serious roles. His success opened doors, but his image also narrowed what Hollywood thought black actors could do. He was both liberation and limitation, both breakthrough and barrier. Watch his films now, knowing this. In the heat of the night, brilliant, powerful, but Detective Tibbs is so controlled, so perfect. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? His character is so accomplished he's almost not human. Sidney played these roles with incredible skill and dignity. But they weren't complete people. They were symbols of what black people could be if they were perfect enough. And nobody is perfect enough. Today, Sidney Poitier is remembered as a legend. But younger generations sometimes struggle to understand why he was important. His characters seem stiff. His dignity feels performative. That's because it was performative. It had to be. Sidney was performing not just for entertainment, but for survival. His dignity was armor. His perfection was protection. He couldn't afford to be human because America wouldn't allow black men to be human and successful simultaneously. An empty movie theater, a single spotlight on a seat in the center. On the screen, frozen, Sidney Poitier's face from Lilies of the Field. That gentle smile, those kind eyes, that unshakable dignity. And if you listen closely past the silence, you can hear it. Not the sound of triumph, but the sound of exhaustion. The sound of a man who carried an entire race's hopes on his shoulders for 30 years and never once complained, never once broke character, never once allowed himself to be less than perfect. Some people break barriers. Sidney Poitier was the barrier breaker who became a barrier himself. And that's not a criticism. It's a tragedy, because he deserved to be more than a symbol. He deserved to be a man. But America never gave him that choice. So how do you remember Sidney Poitier? As the pioneering legend who broke racial barriers in Hollywood, or as the man who had to be perfect his entire career because America wouldn't accept anything less? Share with us in the comments. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe.